Webinar is now streaming live on YouTube.
Yep, I see that.
Mhm.
There is a bit of a delay before it actually shows up though, so we'll give it a second.
Okay.
Okay, the only person I do not see is Ron Heinbach. I do see a Sharon Taylor in our attendee list. I don't know if maybe this is Sharon Heinbach. If so, could you raise your hand and confirm that for me? You can click the little raise hand button on the bottom of your screen. Okay. All right, I think everybody is here, John. You got the thumbs up to roll with it.
Okay, first and foremost, let me thank everybody for attending this special meeting on somewhat short notice. But we'll start, Mayor Tookie, if you'd like to lead us in the pledge.
Sure. Do you want Kelly to do a roll call?
Yeah,
Okay. Kelly, if you could do a roll call, and it's 7:06.
Trustee Barella,
Here.
Trustee Graham,
Here.
Trustee Wager,
Here.
Trustee McKay,
she's here.
I see her.
Trustee Rinaldi,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lashley,
Here.
and Madam Mayor Tookie.
Here. Okay, I've got the flag. So we'll start with the pledge. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation,
under
God,
Indivisible.
With liberty.
liberty and justice for all. Thank
All
you.
right. And Mayor, if you wouldn't mind reading the protocols.
Okay. So these are the protocols of the board and staff and public for town meetings. The mayor runs the meeting. To speak, trustee and staff raise hand and speak when recognized by mayor. Only one speaker at a time. Open public participation throughout the meeting will no longer be allowed. Conversations between trustees and public will no longer be allowed except at public comment portions of the meeting. We address each other as trustee and Madam Mayor. We move contentious items to the beginning of the agenda. We post each agenda on the whiteboard in the meeting room. Public participation, public comment at the beginning of the meetings for agenda or non-agenda items, but not criticism of staff and not for public hearings. If the public has questions, comments, concerns about the town staff, public shall inform the administrator through written email. If the public has questions, comments, or concerns about town administrator, the public shall inform either the mayor or a trustee through written email. Introduction of agenda item by the administrator, discussion on agenda item, and then motion and second on action items, then final discussion on the specific motion. Trustee and mayor shall adhere to and enforce the new protocol of the board for town meetings through compliance with their adopted accountability protocol and operating agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll just give a brief overview. The reason we're holding this special meeting is that the negotiations with Silverton Lakes, consulting, surveying, et cetera, that we'll be presenting to you this evening have all been heard by this board for the past 9 months. And we felt it was important that this board, with its knowledge, before we seat a new board, heard this presentation and ordinance and considered it for approval, just given the 9 months of experience and so forth. Further, in September, this board signed a letter of intent setting forth kind of the negotiating points and strategy back in September. So that's the reason. Unfortunately, the timing is such that there's a lot of stuff going on right now that we didn't anticipate. But again, I appreciate you all for taking this meeting and considering this ordinance for approval, among other documents. So with that, we're going to have a presentation first by Kyle Seiser from Cottonwood Consulting. They've been the primary consultant and engineer on the wetland issues, followed by a presentation by Paul Kosnick and I, and then we'll hear the ordinance. But actually, after the two presentations, Lisa Branner, so you know, we'll open it up for public comment. So Kyle will go first, Paul and I second. Then we will open up for any questions or comments to the public, again, following our 3-minute duration per individual, as always. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle. I think it makes sense to have him start to put this whole kind of project and issue in context and to speak specifically to wetlands and wetland technical matters. I'll point out that we do have Kyle, obviously, on video. We have Ron and/or Sharon Heinbaugh on the phone, it looks like. They're the owners of Silverton Lakes. And we have Kara Hellig, who is with the Army Corps of Engineers, on the phone as well. I think those are our oh, I'm sorry, and Lisa Merrill, of course, is joining us as well. She's also an owner and interested party in the Silverton Lake property area. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I'm Kyle Seiser with Cottonwood Consulting. We are consultants working for Silverton Lakes Campground and Ron on this project. Thank you to everyone from the town for being available and giving me this opportunity to present this project to you guys. And John and Paul have been great to work with, so I appreciate the town's good communication, and thank you to Lisa too for organizing this meeting. I believe there were some slides. I don't know if those are available for people to see. And there they are.
Just put them up on the screen there for you, Kyle.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'll give a quick background on wetlands, and then we'll get into the specific situation at Silverton Lakes and how impacts to those wetlands are being mitigated. So in general, wetlands are areas that have sufficient water to support wetlands vegetation in saturated conditions. So essentially, it means there's water present for long enough during the year that these water-loving plants can really thrive. And I'm talking about, you know, willows and sedges and that type of wetlands vegetation. There's several types of wetlands: swamps, marshes, bogs, and in the case of Silverton Lakes, there are fen wetlands, and we'll talk about what that means in a little more detail in a bit. But why are wetlands important? Why do we care about these things? Well, they have a lot of benefits. The most obvious one is wildlife habitat. There's an abundance of biodiversity associated with wetlands, both aquatic and terrestrial species. So those are really important. But some of the other less known benefits, they're great filters for filtering out contaminants and improving water quality. Basically, when runoff occurs, these wetlands can filter out sediment and nutrients and chemicals before those things discharge to open water, in the case of this project, the Animas River. So it's really helpful in that sense. Other than that, they act as sponges to control water flow and runoff, and that prevents floods that can be damaging to towns and things. these wetlands soak up water during certain times, and other times they slowly release it. So that prevents these floods. They protect from erosion in the sense that vegetation cover on the ground can help prevent erosion. And also by lowering these water flows and controlling that, you can prevent erosion. Lastly, they provide a lot of educational opportunities. It's almost like an outdoor laboratory visiting these wetlands. This picture here is some Silverton High School students that came out to the Silverton Lakes campground, and we're doing the Wetlands 101 talk with them in the field of sedges there. Next slide, please. So how are wetlands protected? Well, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act establishes a program that essentially regulates the discharge of material into waters of the US, including wetlands. The Army Corps of Engineers, they administer this program and require that a permit is obtained prior to any work that could impact a wetlands. Now, during that planning process, the goal is always to avoid impacts to wetlands, but if they have to happen, to minimize them, and they're required to mitigate any unavoidable impacts. So how do you mitigate these impacts? Well, there's different types of mitigation. There's restoration, where you can reestablish, for example, a degraded wetland, such as the picture in the bottom right there at the Silverton Lakes campground. You can establish new wetlands, basically creating wetlands, or you can enhance or improve existing wetlands, or preserve existing functioning wetlands. So those are the different types of mitigation approaches. The Army Corps has to be involved and approve these mitigation plans. So that's kind of the background of how they're regulated. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about this specific project. So this picture is an aerial photo of the Silverton Lakes campground. You can see the RV sites in the central portion of the image. But what I want you to really look at is all the green surrounding areas to the east, west, and south, south of Campground Road there. These are wetlands. There's over 30 acres of wetlands just in the immediate vicinity of the project area. But quite frankly, that wetlands complex, it goes much farther than that along the Animas River corridor. This wetland specifically is a fen wetland. Okay, so that means it's a peat land. There's an abundance of peat or decomposing vegetation present at the site. And the unique characteristics about fens are its groundwater fed. Most of its water from shallow groundwater, as opposed to precipitation like some other wetlands. The vegetation that dominates this specific site includes willows, we all know those, sedges, which is a wetland species that looks like a grass, but it has edges. You say sedges have edges, that's how you ID them. And shrub birch, which are the low-lying shrubs across the site. So that's kind of the background of this wetland area. You see there's a pond just south of Campground Road in the blue outline there. And then the Animas River is in the bottom right corner of the image. So what we had occur here is, I'll talk about these colors here. The red shaded area is an area where gravel was placed in a fen wetland to improve RV sites. And because of that impact to that fen wetland and the placement of fill in the wetland, there's now a requirement to offset those impacts through mitigation. And Cottonwood's prepared a mitigation and monitoring plan, and there's a couple different approaches within the mitigation project. The blue outlined areas on this map we refer to as the phase 2 preservation areas. Now those areas are functioning existing wetlands, and there's a proposal that the town would receive an easement from Silverton Lakes, who owns that property, and that easement would protect those areas in perpetuity. So forever you couldn't develop it, and it would be protective of the aquatic resource. So those are the phase 2 preservation areas that are being proposed for protection through this easement from Silverton Lakes to the town. The yellow area is the phase 1 area where there's going to be some actual physical work done to better that area. And that work includes revegetation of bare ground areas within the degraded wetland, and also enhancement of the adjacent wetland within the yellow boundaries. Now, both of these areas, I say are owned by Silverton Lakes, but there are these roads and alleys that I'll let the town speak to more, that the town currently owns within those boundaries. But I'll let the town and John and Paul discuss that issue. But big picture, the blue and the yellow outlines are mitigation areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so the impacts and mitigation, just to get in a little detail, the first couple bullets of these slides really just emphasize that there's been a lot of historic use out on this area, including mining, presence of livestock, and more recently, the use of the area as a campground and RV resort. Ditches were installed to essentially improve the surrounding area. And what I mean by that is essentially the installation of ditches dries up the surrounding area so that it can be used for some purpose, such as a campground. Now the ditches, aerial photos suggest these ditches were there long before the occupancy of the area by the campground, but they've been maintained over the year. And the ditches concentrate that water that would otherwise be shallow groundwater in the surrounding wetland. So that's how the presence of ditches can impact that wetland. It takes that water away, essentially. In 2017, as I said, the gravel and utilities were installed to improve RV sites that were in that red shaded area on the map. And that was about 0.53 acres of fill put into that wetland. So now there's mitigation required to offset those impacts. Cottonwood's prepared a mitigation and monitoring plan. And as I said, the phase 1 yellow area would reestablish a degraded wetland by revegetating bare ground areas. We would also do enhancement within the adjacent functioning wetland within that yellow area. And that's phase 1. Some of that work has already been done through Ron's efforts and in coordination with Cottonwood. And then the phase 2 area is the preservation area. It's approximately 3 acres. And that's the area that Silverton Lakes would grant an easement to the town that would protect the area in perpetuity. So there's no physical work to be done in phase 2 like there is in phase 1. The phase 2 blue outline areas would just be essentially a paper exercise to preserve those areas in perpetuity. Now there's a monitoring component to these mitigation plans that require that annual monitoring be conducted to make sure that the conditions on the site are meeting the ecological performance standards identified in the plan. So what that means is if the plan says after 1 year, you should have 20% vegetation cover in these bare ground areas that have been revegetated, and then in year 2, 30%, and you want to see that increase each year. And by year 5, you have to meet that standard of your monitoring plan. It also has standards with respect to groundwater levels. We hope that ditch restoration pushes water back into the wetlands and helps the hydrology of the site. But you have to monitor for a minimum of 5 years, and you have to have 2 years with no human intervention, meaning in year 4, you can't go out, plant 100% vegetation cover and say that you met the standard. You have to have 2 years with no human intervention. As I said, some work's been done already, including ditch restoration and vegetation planting, and we'll just look at some quick pictures of those, and then I'll wrap this up. Next slide, please. So in 2018, some of the ditches within the campground were restored. The top 2 photos in this show the ditches prior to restoration, and as you can see, there's water flowing in those ditches. And then in the bottom, you see what it looked like immediately after backfilling. So when you backfill those ditches, the idea is the water that was once in the ditch will be pushed into the surrounding wetland and really help the hydrology of the site by making more water available to these plants. Next picture, please. The phase 1 area, which was the yellow one, has had some physical work done already in 2018 and 2019. So as you can see, top left, it was bare ground area due to historic activities that have altered the hydrology and the vegetation at the site. So now we're trying to revegetate that. We had Silverton High School students come out in 2018. They planted some sedges and did some test plots for us. And then in 2019, we had Fort Lewis students come out from their environmental studies program. They planted more sedges, did some seeding of wetlands grasses and mulching. And then finally, bottom right, at the end of 2019, Cottonwood did some willow stakings. So that's the vegetation that's been planted to date. We hope during the monitoring event in 2020 that we'll see leafed out willow stakings, green sedges, and some of that seed coming up. Next slide, please. Okay, now the phase 2 area. You know, like I said, the phase 1 area, the town's a little less involved in the sense that Ron has taken on those efforts and the cost to revegetate that area. Now, the town might, you could say, benefit from those efforts in the phase 1 area because it achieves the goal of the monitoring and mitigation plan, which is necessary for compliance in this situation with the Army Corps. But really the phase 1 area, those efforts have been done by Silverton Lakes Campground, and the town's had sort of limited involvement. Now the phase 2 area, the town has more involvement with. This is the areas in the blue outlines. It includes a 1-acre pond and then other areas of functioning, existing, thriving wetlands. The idea with phase 2 is that Silverton Lakes would grant an easement to the town. It would be protected in perpetuity. And one of the reasons I wanted to show these slides is just to show how healthy and you know, thriving some of these wetlands are in this area around the campground. So next slide, please. And then this final slide is a little less to do with the wetlands, but Campground Road is being proposed as an easement to the town for road and utility use. And it's an existing gravel road that goes through the campground. And it's bordered by wetlands on both sides. You can see some of the vegetation on either side of the road there. And the reason I want to point that out is it just makes a lot of sense to me for that easement to occur and for that road, that existing road to be used. Because to build a new road through a wetlands in a different area, there's some serious environmental, financial, and engineering challenges associated with that. It's expensive, it's tough to do in a wetlands, and you have impacts to an environmental resource. So the use of that existing road makes a lot of sense to me from those standpoints. So that's all I had. I don't know if I should accept questions at this time or if Paul and John would like to do their presentation.
Why don't we accept questions from the board at this time while it's still fresh in their memory before Paul and I get started? How does that sound? Does anybody have a question for Kyle?
Kyle, this is a part question for you and maybe also a part question for Ron or Sharon if they're here online as well. How much has it cost Silverton Lakes to undergo this mitigation effort so far?
Well, you know, we're just at the start in a sense. I think that so far it's been probably $10,000 or more just for the consulting services, the preparation of plans, some of the surveying that's gone into it. And so that cost will be just for those items. Now, whether there's been other fees such as attorney fees and that sort of thing, I don't know. But there's monitoring every year that's required, and there's maintenance associated with these the revegetation effort. So I think easily the entire project could be upwards of $60,000 if you count the monitoring that has to occur every year, the report that has to be written, the field work that has to be done. And that again wouldn't even include attorney fees to do, you know, paperwork and that sort of thing. Also, I'd like to point out, you know, we had a lot of volunteer labor, which is very common in wetlands mitigation projects. You know, it's an educational opportunity. Students get to get out there, get their hands dirty, learn something, and we get the benefit of having that help in the field. So if you were to hire paid people to dig up sedges and plant them and do some of this physical work, I mean, it's easily over $100,000, I would think. So we're at the start now. We had some unique circumstances. I can speak to the surveying and the consulting costs to date. But yeah, big picture, these things can get expensive fast. And I will say, I believe that Ron at Silverton Lakes has funded all those efforts to date, and the with respect to the revegetation effort and the preparation of the plan itself.
As far as the monitoring is going to go on this project, is that who's going to be responsible for doing the monitoring?
Sure.
And how, sorry, keep going.
Oh, no, I was going to say Cottonwood would most likely do that monitoring. You know, we wrote the plan and we established these ecological performance standards. So annually we'd go out there and do vegetation transects. And again, this is in the phase 1 area only. We do vegetation transects to make sure that, you know, we're meeting those standards and those goals. We'd also look at groundwater levels. Cottonwood has installed monitoring wells for Ron to monitor the water level in the mitigation area. We do weed maintenance to make sure it's not getting overrun with weeds. So those are all the ecological performance standards that we'd have to look at for that phase 1 reestablishment area. Now for phase 2, there might be some need for monitoring just to make sure that the standard of not developing is being met. Because that phase 2 area where the town would be granted that easement, there need to be some monitoring to make sure that, you know, those phase 2 areas are not being developed.
Yeah, this is Kara with the Army Corps of Engineers. I was going to step in real quick. So with the requirement as to who's going to be monitoring, that requirement would fall on the permittee. And I think everyone understands the history of the site, and please step in if you don't, but the site was originally identified as a violation of the Clean Water Act because what occurred was 0.53 acres of fen was filled as a result of the enlargement of the RV park. And part of that is also the town of Silverton's land. And so when we look at violations, we do look at the responsible parties as being both the landowner, so that's both the town of Silverton and the Silverton RV park, along with any entities doing the work. So any contractors that were hired to do the work. So Ron, in order to resolve a violation, there's several options. And one of them is to apply for an after-the-fact permit to authorize that fill. And so that was the option that Ron decided to take. The Corps never required any option. We generally allow, unless somebody's going to lose life or, you know, extreme property loss, the Corps generally allows those resolution options to fall on the shoulders of the entities responsible for the violation. And in this case, the options would have been a voluntary restoration in which he could have pulled out the material and restored the site. He or town of Silverton could have pulled out the material and restored the site, or apply for an after the fact. And so if we grant an after the fact permit, which I'm hoping to do to resolve this violation, that's what we're working towards, then the permittee, the person that holds that permit, is the responsible party for ensuring the terms and conditions of that permit are met. So With that, there would be a condition in the permit that required the implementation of the mitigation plan as approved. And we would cite the mitigation report that Kyle has put together. And so in that mitigation report, it does discuss monitoring. And usually there's a separate condition that also requires annual monitoring reports until the site is determined successful to meet certain performance standards, which are part of that mitigation report. And so being that Ron's applying for the permits, he would be the permittee, and so he would be the responsible party. Now, once a conservation easement is placed on a land, and so the second aspect of the mitigation being preservation. So as Kyle said, you can do restoration, creation, enhancement, or preservation. And we generally don't accept preservation unless an area is unless an area is high quality and susceptible for impact. And in this case, we felt like it was a good opportunity because it is susceptible for impact with the enlargement of and activities of recreation in the RV park, which don't necessarily fall under the Clean Water Act. And so if somebody would go in there and mow the sites, or ATVs would, run through that wetland area, it could definitely significantly or substantially degrade that wetland area. And so as a conservation easement, the reason why we're looking at a conservation easement over deed restriction is because we'd want that third party to be able to monitor the site. And so if the town of Silverton decides to hold the easement, they're responsible for ensuring that those easement terms and conditions are being met. And so therefore, there's an aspect of monitoring that would fall on the town of Silverton's shoulders by holding that easement to ensure that the easement is met. But at the same time, it's also in the town of Silverton's benefit because this violation's being resolved that they're also a responsible party too. Does that help clarify things a little bit further, that answer?
Yep, I think so. Thank you, Kara. Does anybody have a question for Kara specifically? Okay, anything else for Kyle at this time?
It looks like Judy was trying to speak. I think Judy's mic, it may be muted. Judy.
Yeah, there you go, Trustee Graham.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, the campground road, whose property is that?
I believe that is owned by Silverton Lakes, and it's being proposed to grant an easement to the town for road and utility access, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. It actually, Trustee Graham, travels over various property ownerships, including the town's established or platted right-of-way. But this easement would, in essence, you grant town full access and utility easement over that road. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions at this time, Paul, why don't you and I go ahead on our presentation. If it's okay with you, I'll let you take the lead as you put together most of this and I can just chime in. Is that okay?
Sure, sounds good.
So Lisa Branner, if you could put page 4 in the board package is where we start. Is it possible to get that on screen?
Give me just a second and I'll get it up there for you.
Okay.
And I guess while Lisa is trying to get that up on screen, first of all, thanks Kyle for that presentation. I think that was a great opening and provide some context for the board, as we go into our presentation. And also just to kind of take a step back to what John started this whole conversation with is, today we just wanted the board to have the opportunity to consider the first reading of the ordinance that would vacate the streets and alleys that we'll be discussing. And by no means is there any magic deadline on the vacation. However, because the board has, some knowledge, there's been town resources putting in to try to, prepare this board in the past, that we want to give you at least the opportunity to consider it. And obviously the timing is not ideal for this, but, there's also at the same time, no obligation today to say yay or nay. It could be continued, but we think we're providing you with the basis to make a decision. But I just want to make that clear that, there's nothing magical about today's date. And if the board does approve the first reading today, then it would move on to a second reading prior to it actually being finalized and approved as an ordinance. So with that, I will start with the presentation that we put together, and a lot of this has already been touched on by Kyle, and he's done it, I think, even better because he's provided you with kind of the maps and the pictures that really illustrate, what we're talking about in this area. Lisa, next slide, please. So the Silverton Lakes RV Resort, as Kyle mentioned, it's private land there. That's also contains public land in the sense of the streets and the alleys. And there's also, some kind of odd pieces within this area that the town also owns, little corners and chunks. And that's because these roads are from kind of the original platting of this area. And like a lot of that's common in a lot of municipalities and subdivisions, a lot of this was platted without regard to the topography. So back when the original roads and alleys were put on a map, it wasn't based on necessarily the topography of the land. So we got some weird areas where roads just end here and there's little triangles and pieces. And that's also owned by the town. In the private property within what we'll refer to as Silverton Lakes, it is held, a lot of the areas held by Ron's entity, the Silverton Lakes RV Resort entity. And Lisa, who's on this too, also owns some of the private property within that general area. And so we'll talk about that a little bit further down. Next slide, please. So to provide a little more context on the background of all this, the streets and alleys in this area were originally leased to the then owner of Silverton Lakes in 1971. So that was the first time that the town allowed Silverton Lakes to utilize public property for the resort. In 1990, there was an amendment to that lease. And then in 2014, a new lease was entered into by the town and the then owner of Silverton Lakes. And it allows in all those leases for the town property to be used for private purposes. It doesn't allow for any permanent structures to be placed, in the streets and alleys, but it also is maybe generally unclear on what exactly can be done in some of these areas. Next slide, please. So Kara just did a good job of kind of going through, and so did Kyle, on the alleged Army Corps violations. And so I won't spend too much time on this one, but I think it's just important to know that, in some way, whether, it's through the proposed process that the board will start considering tonight or some other process, the Army Corps violation needs to be resolved by the town because it does infect town property, and that's where part of the violation occurred. So whatever the outcome is, this is a central focus for the town to address. Next slide, please. So again, I think Kyle did a good job, and Kara as well, as talking about the possible ways of remedying the alleged violations. I think that the town and Silverton Lakes could have kind of gone on their own and tried to remedy it each individually. But I think that Silverton Lakes took the lead on trying to remedy the violation. And, and what is being proposed is kind of a cooperative effort for the two entities to address the violation. Okay, next slide, please. So as Kyle mentioned, the proposed plan details a combination of the preservation and reestablishment of the wetlands. And Kara and Kyle talked about the responsibilities of each. And I think from a monitoring perspective, if the town were to be granted those preservation easements, the town would have a responsibility in the future to make sure that, to go out on the property, maybe put up signs, take some other steps to make sure that there wasn't any development that was going on in that area that the town was not aware of. And the easement's going to be recorded with the land, so it will be clear to anybody that is purchasing that land in the future that it's undevelopable land. But the town will also have somewhat of an obligation to just make sure that, that nothing's going on property that they have a responsibility for. Next slide, please. So with your board packets, you were provided the letter of intent. And again, this is just kind of how we got to where we are. It identified the preservation and reestablishment areas and also talked about the grant of an easement for Campground Road. Also a river trail easement that was based on the conceptual plans that the town has. It discusses abandoning or vacating the streets and alleys in the area and the responsibility of costs associated with all this work. Again, nothing in the letter of intent is binding on either party. It's just kind of a background on how we got to where we are, excuse me, and just helps, I think, the board have understanding that, there's been some work going into this and how we have come to this point. Next slide, please. So the preservation area, Kyle had provided that map, and I think we also have that included as exhibit C, I believe, on here, and D, and it demonstrates where the three areas are going to be, where the town would be taking on the preservation easement. And
those are the areas highlighted in blue, and it is exhibit D as in dog in your board package. That would be on page 34 if you want to refer to exhibit D. Thank you.
And I think that exhibit's also helpful too. It shows some of the other kind of wetlands in the area, some of the dead fen, and I think there's somebody on this that will talk about, some of those areas and whether there's restoration efforts in mind for those areas. But it gives kind of a good general idea of what this overall area looks like from a wetlands perspective. So we have the proposed, the board has looked at the proposed easement in the past. It's again, would be discussed potentially later on today. And that's not what the board specifically would be considering today, but it would be part of the second reading of the ordinance if it makes it that far. The other point that I just want to point out in the easement itself, there's some language about indemnification. So if something occurred, there was disturbance that was a result of Silverton Lake specific actions, then they would be indemnifying the town for that. And that means that they would be taking on any kind of liability associated with the disturbance if it was caused by Silverton Lake specifically. Next slide, please. The other component of this was the access and utility easement. That includes both the Campground Road easement and the Animas River Trail easement is what we're referring to it as. The Campground Road easement varies in width. That's because of the existing wetlands that are there. It goes, I believe, right outside, and maybe Kyle could talk to this a little better, but it goes right outside of the existing disturbed areas. Currently, it's not an easement of record with the clerk and recorder's office, meaning the town has never been officially granted an access right on that road. There is a utility easement that's there, but this would be granting an access and utility easement across there. There's also another utility easement that would be running across the Silverton Lakes property that would be granted as part of that too. And I believe that's identified also on one of the exhibits. Is that right, John?
I don't think we have the 20-foot utility easement identified.
Okay. And that was,
and that's actually an existing sewer line and an existing easement anyway. It wouldn't be a new easement, Paul. And we have an established sewer line and manholes along that area.
but that is actually going to be on what I'll refer to as the above the campground road. That's where that easement exists.
Okay, yes.
Next slide, please. So statute authorizes governing bodies to they're allowed to vacate streets and alleys. They can be vacated by ordinance if it's been used, if the areas have been used as a roadway. Ordinance isn't required if these areas have never been used as a roadway. Here, it seems as if the roadways have never been used as roadways, but we're taking more of a conservative approach here and doing it through the ordinance process. So one of the requirements is that the vacation of a street cannot leave any adjacent landowners without access. And so we'll talk about that, I believe, on the next slide, please, Lisa. So if a governing body officially vacates a street or alley, that the title of those streets and alleys go to the abutting landowner. So essentially in this case, in most instances here, it's going to be based on the center line of the street or the alley, and it kind of goes then to the abutting landowners. There's 6 total here, I believe, landowners in this proposal that would acquire additional land through the vacation, meaning they would take on the certain portion of the streets and alleys. And here the streets vary from either 100 feet in width to 80 feet in width, and the alleys are 14 feet in width. The adjacent highway that's running up there, that's not considered a landowner, so there would not be land going to the to the other government. Next slide, please. So the proposal would be to vacate the streets and alleys identified on the exhibit. They were originally platted, as I've talked about. The majority of them, pretty much all of them, have never been constructed except for the campground road, which does cross streets and alleys along the way. Campground road is not part of the original platting. The wetlands, ponds, river pools are all within the streets and alleys as shown kind of by the pictures and the maps. There are areas in the streets and alleys that are would be considered developable. And so property owners would be able to take advantage of those certain areas and potentially use those in future plans if desired. But I think the majority of the areas is going to be considered wetlands. So there are approximately, I know this was a question of the board previously, how much acreage would be vacated, and those streets and alleys are 12 acres approximately. Okay, next slide, please. So as mentioned by Kyle, and maybe Kara could provide some more input on this in the future if the board desires, but the Army Corps would require a property owner in the town here to look first toward an alternative before developing the roads and alleys in the wetlands areas. And if there was no other alternatives, then, you know, that's where the mitigation would come into play. So it makes development of streets and alleys in this area more costly and more difficult if the Army Corps allows for it. Okay, next slide, please. So a couple of the benefits of the vacation. The first one being that it would allow for the town to settle the Army Corps' violation. It would reduce future liability with the Army Corps. And by that, I mean that currently the town kind of got into this current position because it leased the land, being the streets and alleys in this area, and it was disturbed without potentially the town having a knowledge of the disturbance. And so if the roads are vacated in that area, the town would no longer own the streets and alleys. So if there was disturbance in those areas and the town was not aware of it, it wouldn't matter because they would not have the liability because they would not have the ownership of the underlying land. Another benefit, as Kyle kind of hit on, was that it does create preservation areas and wildlife and all the other benefits that he mentioned that wetlands provide. Potentially can allow other owners to plan around these wetlands and potentially help restore other wetlands. And, you know, some people might look at this as a positive or a negative, but it allows other lands that are streets and alleys that could be developed in the future if the roads are vacated. Meaning, you know, if there's a portion of a road somewhere that could be developed, it'll allow it to be developed. So I guess that one could go on either a benefit or a negative, depending on what your viewpoint is on that. So next slide, please. So the negatives would be the town would no longer be able to develop the streets and alleys. I know that there's this part of potentially the river corridor down there. And so there's an interest in making sure that there's access along that area. So no longer would the streets and alleys that are platted be able to be part of those future plans if they, you know, come to fruition. Also, there is no certainty that this will, I guess, always be wetlands. And again, I think, you know, Kyle might be the expert and could talk to that further if desired, but if some of these areas dry up, could they potentially be used for roads or streets and alleys in the future? And that's a possibility. And also, a lot of these areas could be developed through a PUD in the future, and that would allow, you know, more of a comprehensive plan. So I guess that's kind of another one that's either a negative or a positive, depending on how you look at it. Next slide, please. That's the last one. So the proposal that the board would be considering, again, the main thing for consideration today is just the first reading of the ordinance that would vacate the streets and alleys in this area. The part of the proposal, though, also would be then if the first reading is passed, the next meeting would be to consider the campground road access and utility easement. And that includes the river trail easement. Also, it would then the town would receive the conservation easement and terminate the lease with Silverton Lakes, because if there's no longer any streets and alleys in the area, there's no lease to Silverton Lakes anymore. So that kind of wraps up our presentation. John, if you have stuff that you want to add, maybe prior to opening it up here to questions.
Yeah, no, I think you covered our presentation very well. Thank you, Paul. What I'd like to do is invite Lisa Merrill if she desires, to speak a little bit to her interest in the area and plans for restoring wetlands. Lisa, would you like to speak a little bit to that before we open it up for public comment?
Yeah, sure. I'm not real prepared with anything in
I'm
particular.
sorry to have put you on the spot, but I thought it might be worth having you speak a little bit if you'd like to.
Sure, thanks. Sean and I have been, I guess after all of this happened, we were concerned about what could we do to help the situation out there in the wetland. And so what we ended up doing was purchasing some wetlands, and those wetlands are surrounded on all sides by Silverton Lakes Campground. And we've been looking at how to get a part of block number 4 restored. And Kara got us introduced to CDOT, who is interested in doing a mitigation plan there, and would then be able to fund a restoration project there. That still is pending on what happens with this abandonment and a couple other things, but I think the abandonment would certainly propel it further a lot quicker. And let's see, I suppose that's about enough. And we're happy to answer any questions as well. We do want to eventually seek a conservation easement, but we think we're a long ways out from that.
Thank you, Lisa. Does anybody have any other questions for our presenters? Looks like Mayor Pro Tem, you have a question?
Yeah, just curious, Lisa, which properties do you own in this kind of map that we have here? Is it all of like block 5 there?
Yeah, all of 5 and E. And then after this abandonment, then we would be purchasing half of block 4, the part with the dead fen on it, as well as 6 from Ron.
And if I may direct the board to exhibit D as in dog, you can see in kind of a reddish clouding where the dead fen is located that Lisa's speaking of. That's on page 34 of your board books. Okay, does anybody else have a question? Anthony Edwards, do you have anything you'd like to add? I know you've been in, oh, Trustee Decay would like to have a question. Can we take Trustee Decay off of mute?
Okay. My question would be, is there any development value on the west side of the road in the streets and alleys?
Trustee Decay, I would categorize it as very little. The vast majority of it is on wetland. It has wetlands contained on it or abuts wetlands. You know, the town's development value would only be streets and alleys. As Paul said, you know, a private owner may find some developable area in the streets and alleys,
Okay.
But very little.
And my next question would be the town's engineering. We have a contract with a engineering firm, and have they looked at this from the town's perspective?
We have not engaged our town engineer on this, no.
And can I ask why?
I guess didn't see the need is the answer.
I guess which portions would you want the engineer to look at? Just that general overall concept of what they're proposing here with the mitigation versus the restoration areas?
I would just say the entire plan, that, you know, that from the town's perspective, that we would have our engineer look at this entire, before we make a decision.
Especially, I wonder, would it be worthwhile to have the engineer weigh in on the utility easement portion of it at least?
John, I believe you've talked with him, haven't you, on these issues of the utility? You've talked with staff meetings on the placement of utilities.
We talked, yeah, we consulted with Public Work Director John Seitz. We have not consulted with the actual engineer.
What are we thinking the engineer is going to say differently than what's already been proposed and thought out?
And I guess that's kind of what I'm just thinking out loud here is I'm not exactly sure what we would have them look at specifically. I'm not against the idea, but I'd want to make sure we made best use of their time and our money.
Well, I'm sure a lot has already been, you know, our packets. I'm sure that Cottonwood has, you know, if they have fulfilled, they've done a nice job. I'm sure our engineering firm would be delighted. And I don't think we'd spend much having our engineering firm look at this from, especially from the town's perspective.
I agree that there would be value in having the engineer look at it.
We can certainly do that. Is that the entire board's desire?
No.
I think that maybe not necessarily exactly our engineer, but having our own kind of independent assessment of this wetlands area too. If we do decide not to vacate this tonight, might be useful to us in terms of basing a decision on the wetlands area too in this situation.
We're looking at a swath of land that, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, Cottonwoods, as well as our own town attorney that has looked at everything, including Lisa Richardson, purchasing the property, knowing that this is all wetlands. I still am a little confused on what an additional person coming in is going to make a difference on the vacation of the easements in all of this area when it's going into what are we calling it? A conservation in perpetuity. So nothing can be developed on it. I'm a little confused on this.
Trustee Varela, this is not a swap of land. This is a vacation of right-of-way.
But we're putting a section of this land that belongs to the Heinbogs in phase 2 completely into wetland preservation, and nothing can be done with it in perpetuity. Is that not correct?
We are not doing that now.
That is one of our considerations. That is part of the phase development that Cottonwoods, that Kyle explained to us earlier. So I don't understand if that whole section is being vacated as well, what difference it makes, because nothing can be developed into that if it's being done in perpetuity. And Lisa just said that she's interested in creating another section for conservation that once again would be held in perpetuity. So we're taking out most of this land that's not usable right now. So I don't understand why a separate engineering firm would make any difference compared to the planning we've already done and had everybody working through since September.
Buzz on the phone anywhere so we can say hello to them? Sharon, Ron? Are they involved in this meeting?
They're showing on the screen, Trustee Graham. I'm not hearing them though. Lisa, do you have any contact with Ron or Sharon?
I thought they were going to be a part of this meeting.
From what I can tell, they should be able to speak. Let me see if I can get them in here as a panelist.
This is Kara with the Army Corps again. When you guys were talking about getting a third party to look at the development capability, are you talking, what part of the property are you speaking of? Because I don't have the map in front of me. I apologize. Is it phase 1 or phase 2 of the mitigation plan?
I think the board was talking about just generally the streets and alleys in the area. Is that correct, or?
Okay, because if you're looking at an area that is designated as wetland, I shouldn't even say designated, it is wetland, meets the 3 wetland criteria, and it flows into the Animas River, so it is considered a waters of the U.S. When you look at an area, if it for its development potential, you do have to also consider the ability to obtain permits for that area. And so for obtaining a permit for, say, a residential development or even a street or alleyway, if you're impacting less than a half an acre, that permit is authorized underneath our nationwide permits, except because this is a FEN, it's actually not authorized. Because this area is a FEN, let me step back 1 second. Because this area is a FEN, and to develop the area, we would have to look at it underneath a standard permit under today's regulations and today's permits. And by looking at it as a standard permit, we're required to do a full environmental assessment, which requires an alternative analysis. So if you could avoid, if you could put that development somewhere else that still meets its goals and not have wetland impacts or have lesser wetland impacts, then that's what you would be required under the Clean Water Act. So under the Clean Water Act, we have regulations that state that we can only issue a permit if the permit is the least environmentally damaging practical alternative. So for instance, if Ron came to me prior to impacting the wetland, it would have been really difficult for him to obtain a permit. Unfortunately, he did the work, and restoring it after doing the work would be a big challenge too. And after the fact permit, it's probably the best alternative because restoring it's going to be such a challenge because it's already been impacted. So with that said, when you consider how developable a site is, you do have to consider whether or not a permit would even be authorized for doing the work. So I want to keep that in mind. So by contacting an engineer to see whether or not a site is engineerable, that's a different story as to whether or not it could be permitted under the Clean Water Act.
Thank you for that. The Heinbaugh look like they're up now. If they would like to say anything. Hi, Ron and Sharon.
Hello. Well, we can't hear them. Can they be unmuted?
Still can't hear them. Can you hear us? Okay, we're having trouble hearing you for the moment. We're trying to resolve it.
Kara, just so I don't know if we're able to pull up kind of this map here. It's labeled under Exhibit C here. The area that we're talking about vacating extends pretty far beyond just the wetlands areas themselves too. We're talking about vacating 12 acres, and the wetlands areas that we're kind of in question for the Army Corps of Engineers is about 3 acres total.
Thank you, Austin.
Okay, thank you. Yep, and I'm only speaking on I'm only speaking on terms of waters of the U.S. Anything outside of waters of the U.S. is outside of my jurisdiction, and I don't have much of a say, nor can I say much about that area. So thank you for clarifying.
And Mayor Pro Tem, I should point out that the easements that that are identified that total about 3 acres, those aren't the only wetlands on the property. So those easements are not all encompassing as far as containing all the wetlands in that area, if that makes sense.
Administrator Ryder,
Yes.
I am not able to resolve the sound issue for the Heinbachs. I'm wondering if we want to try to call them and put them on speakerphone.
Sure. I have a number for them, so I'm calling right now. Do you want to call, or do you want, would it be easier if I did?
Why don't you do it?
Okay.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate to hear from Sharon and Ron at this point.
Let me give it a shot.
And we could still see them, but we can hear them on the phone. That'll work out.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Ron. Okay, so we're going to attempt to patch you through here. So,
can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay. There are more wetlands on the property than what we're talking about. There's wetlands all the way through that property. So that the chance of developing more structures or anything on there would be near impossible.
So you would say we're not, are we mixing wetland streets and non-wetland streets? I mean, are we both talking about?
I didn't hear Tiffany. It was echoing or something.
Yes, I'm going to put you on mute and let Trustee Decay speak, and then I'll take you off.
Okay.
Tiffany Decay, Trustee Decay, can you repeat your?
Are we mixing streets and alleys that have wetlands and streets and alleys that do not have wetlands? I mean, what streets and alleys are not wetlands that are being proposed?
All the streets and alleys in that whole area are being proposed to be vacated. But there are more wetlands on the property than even on the campground side of the road. Where most RV sites are, there are wetlands throughout there.
Right, but maybe we need to identify those more clearly. What is wetland and what is not wetland?
Maybe Kyle can help with kind of just
On
explaining.
the streets and alleys?
Yeah, maybe Kyle can talk about what the process is for determining here, or Kara, how these streets and alleys would determine which parts are wetlands and which part aren't, because there probably are going to be portions in here that aren't wetlands and some that are, but they could speak about how that's determined.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so there's 3 criteria necessary to be a wetland. And you can do field work to look at this and determine if something is a wetland. And it's water, soil, and vegetation. So you go out and you do test pits with a shovel, and you look for the presence of water, you look for the presence of a certain type of soil that's indicative of a wetlands, and you look for wetlands vegetation. And you have to have all 3 of those in order to be a wetlands. Now, with respect to the Silverton Lakes campground area that I've looked at, I would say the vast majority of that property where there's not development such as an RV spot with gravel, I would say the majority of it are wetlands. Now there are areas where, you know, there's a barn or a gravel parking area, and obviously those are lacking vegetation. And there's one criteria: without that, it's not a wetlands. Even the dead fen technically isn't a wetland in the sense that it doesn't have vegetation. I imagine it was at one point, but it's been degraded, and now we're trying to reestablish that wetland. But yeah, within the Silverton Lakes campground area, almost everything that's not developed is very likely a wetland.
And Kyle, can I ask if the town was interested in determining, you know, the entire roads and streets and alleys in this area, determine which sections are wetlands and which aren't? How would the town go about doing that?
You would hire a consultant that has that expertise, and they'd go out and do that field work. There's wetlands determination forms they'd fill out, and they'd run that exercise to look at the 3 criteria. And then there's wetlands delineations where you scoot over and you do another test pit and you try to draw that boundary between areas that are wetlands and areas that aren't. But yeah, you essentially characterize it and delineate it by digging these test pits.
Well, one thing for sure is we haven't sorted out what piece of land is which piece of land. We don't know what is wetlands, what isn't. And we also, I don't know if we're clear about the waterfront property either. And that kind of falls into a different category.
I was under the impression that the waterfront property is included, am I wrong, Kyle, in what is considered a wetland?
Are we talking about the pond or the Animas River?
I'm talking
Going towards the Animas.
Okay, so the along the Animas, you know, where you have vegetation, shallow water, and the right types of soils, yeah, absolutely, that would be a wetland.
Thank you.
I don't know if that whole area has been delineated, but looking on an aerial photograph right now, I mean, it all has wetland signatures. So it shows areas of saturation. Wetlands show up as certain signatures on aerials based on, you know, willows look a little different than aspen trees, for instance. And so it does look like the area between basically the pond all the way to the Animas is going to be mostly uplands or wetlands, and there may be small areas of uplands where there isn't vegetation. It might be rocky gravel bars, historic rocky gravel bars that just it hasn't quite formed into vegetation yet. But majority of that is going to be wetlands. It appears on aerials. I don't think it's actually been delineated.
Okay, now when we talk about 15-foot easement for riverfront, I mean, why wouldn't that be 50 feet? Why wouldn't that be 100 feet? Why is 15 feet the choice for that river corridor trail?
Because the trail construction would only require 15 feet. We could ask for more.
Okay.
But, you know, I guess we looked at the practicality of putting even a 22-foot gravel road there. The intention was only to be a trail.
And do you delineate that from the center of the river and is the easement from the center of the river?
That's a good question. It is generally along the river, and it could change, and the easement language itself allows for that flexibility, because you're correct. We don't know exactly where it would go.
And how do you deal with the fact that the river boundaries change also?
That's where the easement that we're going to receive or would we propose to receive allows for that flexibility. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, I'm not speaking out of turn, but I think we, to be located in a, place to be determined at some point, I believe is the way the easement reads.
That's correct. In the easement that's identified on Exhibit C there, or I should say the line that's on Exhibit C, that is the river trail easement general location. And that's based, I think, on what I haven't looked at it, but the conceptual plans that have come out of the river corridor group. But the easement itself allows for the easement to be in the as constructed place, meaning wherever it's going to be constructed is going to be the actual easement location.
So Trustee Decay, to answer your question, we feel like we've built in the flexibility to allow for a changing riverside or it'll generally be in that area, but it allows us to be flexible at ultimate construction.
Thank you.
Have any of us walked this land so that we know the specifics of it?
I did fairly extensively this summer, or last summer rather. And I agree with Kyle's assessment and Kara's assessment. It is vastly wetlands. In fact, as I looked at it, the only place that I could see to put a road in is where the existing campground road is, because it is literally surrounded by wetlands.
Could I, another question, could we have Anthony speak about the history of, I do recall, I was not on the board at the time when a previous board signed the lease, the 99-year lease. Just if he could please give us a little background.
Of course, Anthony.
Sure, I brief, and then if there's a question, you can ask me what you may want answered. I worked on this, I think it was 2014, and then after the lease, worked with the previous family, the Andrietta family, and we worked on coming to an agreement. That agreement was a little different than I think that what's being discussed now, and obviously there's a new issue with the alleged violation, as Paul referenced it. There were there are a few issues during that time. I mean, I can bring them up. One of them was was assessing what was wetlands, what's not wetlands. I can say that it's been said multiple times in a lot of the area is wetlands. The second thing that was about the right of way, particularly along the river, can't remember, that fluctuated between, I think, 15 and 25. It may have been more, and we were working through that. And the idea would be to preserve that for some sort of right away for a river walk and that type of thing, and to be able to to be in that area for maybe a bike trail. But the thought was not something so much as concrete as something more primitive in nature. And then there was the last issue that was really at the forefront, was related to was the land going to continue to be subdivided as lots, or was it going to be placed in one large parcel after the vacations, and how was that going to be developed in the future, and what process would it go through? Again, that was 5-6 years ago, I think. Is that right, Ron and Sharon? Do you remember? And so we were going to go ahead and go through with this type of process, but there became a point where those owners were, we had gone for 2 years working with staff and town, and they just were okay. Summer was coming and it was time to go back to work, if you will. And so the owners at that time said, we'll let it go for now. As far as going through with the vacation, we'll continue on the 99-year lease.
So speaking of which, I'd like to hear from Ron and Sharon. Is there something about the lease that you're operating under now that doesn't work for you?
This has worked fine. Can you hear me? Okay.
One sec.
It's just with the Corps of Engineers deal and the wetlands mishap, it's more advantageous for us to do this deal, I think. So that's why we're doing this. That's why we're proposing this, because it takes the liability off the town, and if any other further actions were taken by me or any future owners, there's no responsibility for the town there. And that's why we're doing this. There's nothing wrong with the lease. I'm fine with it. But there again, if I were to sell the place down the road and somebody else come in there and didn't want to be a nice guy or gal and didn't care about the mitigation of this land and the environment of that area, that could pose a big problem for the town. I'm willing to do this work. I had no idea that I was messing up wetlands. None whatsoever. And the city didn't know that I was messing up wetlands. But we had electrical permit. We had Bill and Mark came out there right when we started this project and said, there's no problem here, you can do it. And I have 2 eyewitnesses to testify to that. So it was a big mistake. We didn't know about it. Mark and Bill didn't know about it. And so this is the hand we were dealt, and we're trying to fix it. And we're working hard. We're spending lots of money. Like Kyle said, we're probably looking upwards of $60,000 in 5 years. That's just that part of it, which we're willing to pay. I'm not asking the town for any money. But and we're working on with Lisa on the other side of the road to do that too and put it in conservation, and it's going to be a beautiful area. So I think it's a good deal. It's either way, I can run my business, but I think this is going to help the entire area. It's going to be better for the area. It's going to be better for the town, less liability for the town. And I don't know. I'm doing what I can to try and get this problem solved, and working with the Corps of Engineers. Like I said, I've hired Cottonwood Consulting to do this stuff and get it done right. I'm not trying to cut any corners. And so we want to cooperate and make everybody happy. I guess that's all I've got, unless somebody's got a question.
If I can have a minute to kind of speak on what I'm thinking here, and I wrote a letter to most of the rest of the trustees and to the staff, and I don't feel all that different right now. I think that abandoning town right-of-ways is a really important decision that we need to make. There needs to be a really good reason for it, and there needs to be some really good benefit to the public for us to consider it. And I'm not sure that we quite have the information that we need to make a decision on this bit right now. And I'm not really sure that the value to the community and to the taxpayers has really been demonstrated here. I'm a little concerned looking at some of these maps here in a little bit more detail tonight, that this is being pitched to us as this property is basically worthless. It's all wetlands. I see huge chunks of land that are already developed by Silverton Lakes RV Park. And I think that we need to consider how much of this developable land is part of this. Just for people to be aware, if we're talking about 12 acres, that's potentially 209 lots, city lots. So that's 25 by 100 lots. That's 209 parcels of property, basically, that we're talking about here. And I see a ton of areas here that are already developed. 20th Street, Animas Street, 21st Street, Kendall Street, that are already developed by Silverton Lakes and other areas in here. Hazelton Street and 21st Street along the river. That's area that we already own as part of this river right-of-way here. So I don't see a whole lot of extra right-of-way that we're getting here. The utility easement is great along the campground road. We all love the campground road, but we do have a parallel San Juan County Road 2 there. We haven't talked about what easements we have there. That's got to be what, 200 feet from campground road. I just have a lot of questions here. The value of the developable property, the value of this liability and the cost of the wetland disturbance, the value of that easement to the road. We don't even have an easement that we need to put there. So I see that we need to have some further consideration on this matter right now. And I don't see any reason why we need to approve this right now. That we need to really protect our river corridor. And I think that we really need to think this through a lot more than we currently have.
So this is Kara with the Corps of Engineers again. I am unbiased as to what's decided upon. However, a decision does need to be made soon because this has been an ongoing violation for now 2 years and unresolved. And so we've been pretty flexible with the amount of time that we've allotted both the town of Silverton and the Silverton RV Park to resolve this violation. And we can't have it on our books for much longer. So we'd like to have it resolved by the end of this year. You know, so that means that additional on the ground mitigation work is going to be, need to be occurred because preservation isn't an option. Then that mitigation work needs to start within a month or two, and it takes about that much time to put a mitigation plan together. So I just want to make sure that you guys are aware that there is a clock that's ticking, and the town is also responsible for that clicking talk. That it's the end of the night, that ticking clock.
Eric, can you tell us how much potential liability there is for this for the town and this portion of the town that's town property here in the affected area too? Really, really small area on the side here. I don't know if that makes a difference or not, but it's very, very little of 20th Street and then the alley there in parcel 3 on Exhibit C that we have.
Yeah, it's hard to say, you know, as far as it's hard to divvy up the percentage. So if, for instance, the town decides that they want to resolve their portion of the violation by voluntary restoration, and they want to remove the fill material and resolve that violation, you know, we can talk about, we can divvy up the quantity of impact. I don't know what the acreage is per land ownership, so we can look at and I'm just speaking of options. There's many different ways to skin a cat, so to speak. So one way would be to look up the quantity of acreage, or quantity of land that's been impacted, or quantity of wetlands that have been impacted per land ownership. And each landowner then can be responsible for resolving that particular violation, whether or not it be voluntary restoration, whether or not it be after the fact. I mean, those are the two easiest. The other aspects are going to court, which we don't really want to do. We can refer it to EPA, which we don't really want to do. So I mean, I'll let that kind of land there. So say it's a tenth of an acre. The town would then be responsible for coming up with a tenth of an acre of either mitigation or restoring that area back to its original condition, which I don't know if that would be practical if the RV park decides to retain their fill, because it may not be able to be restored. So as far as liability goes, that's something that the courts would have to decide. We generally just want to work towards, I just want to work towards restoration, or not restoration, but getting it resolved.
It looks like we could resolve that, figure out a way to resolve it, but we probably need a little more detail, especially with regard to what Austin is asking.
And I'm okay with that. I just don't want it to be postponed for much longer. I'm okay with doing a little bit more data gathering if that's what you need to make a decision. And I wouldn't expect a decision to be made maybe today with this presented to you just now. But I don't want it to wait until like midsummer and then have to go a completely different direction on the mitigation plan.
Yeah, Carrie, you just brought up a whole host of things that we haven't even discussed or thought about as far as like a mitigation effort as our potential portion of this. This has only been presented to us in the way of, here's what's on the table, trade 12 acres for the affected piece of property to indemnify, and then these other things, the Riverwalk and easement for utilities as well.
Technically, that's not true. We've had since September, when this initially came to us, to have a discussion about anything additional that we thought we could do. And Mr. Heinbach specifically said he would be willing to pay for the mitigation. So we kind of threw up our hands and said, okay, let's look at this other route. So there has been other considerations. Maybe we're forgetting them because they happened last year, but it has been discussed.
Yeah, I know that they have gone through a number of ideas, because land is limited. The land that you can actually physically do mitigation on is limited. And when I say physically do mitigation on, I'm talking about restoration or enhancement or creation of wetland. There is a lot of wetland on the property. And so originally Ron looked at putting that land in a conservation easement and working with Lapato Open Space, but it wasn't financially feasible for him to do that, as I understand. And then he discussed transferring the land to the town, and maybe Kyle, you could step in. I don't remember why that didn't work out, because you can transfer it to a public domain and have it protected that way. And it was discussed that the easiest method would be a conservation easement. To try to find land to actually do physical mitigation on becomes extremely challenging, and that is one of the reasons why CDOT is working with Lisa, because they have mitigation obligations that they tried to fulfill and it failed, because doing physical mitigation work, unless you're doing a restoration site, can be really, or even restoration sites can be really challenging, and it's a high risk and high uncertainty. And so with that said, mitigation options are very minimal and very limited in the town. And I know that Ron and Kyle spent a long time looking at different alternatives, and have been working with the town for a while as well to try to fit everyone's needs, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess lest the board feel that staff and Attorney Kosnick, we're out on our own doing this. We had an executive session where we were given direction to pursue this negotiation. We signed a letter of intent where the provisions were laid out as to how we would conduct the negotiations. So I don't I don't want the board to think we went off on our own here. We were following, basically the instructions of the board as to how we would approach the negotiation with the Heinbachs.
Well, everybody appreciates all the work that everybody's done. It might be the right thing to look at a few more details. And then there's one other thing that we haven't even brought up, which the town board has a responsibility with, which is the master plan and what the future plans are that will go into that.
Well, if it's turned into a a wetland conservation area, there is no plan. So I'm not sure what's happening. Did the Kendall Mountain Steering Committee come up with some other use for this land besides just a river trail that was already proposed that we had discussed? I'm just a little confused why this is coming up now when we should be at the verge of making a decision, because we have had many, many months since this happened. We have all taken, hopefully, a good look at what has been proposed to us as a board, brought to us in executive session. And so we've had these discussions. So I'm still a little confused why now, right there, when it's time to make the decision, we're forgetting what we've already done in the past to put it to this point. So what is it about the river corridor that you think is going to be developable, I can't even quite say that right now, that is changing your minds? Is it attached to the ski area somehow that we're not hearing about something going on? I'm just really curious where this is all coming from now.
Well, I'm going to have to say absolutely not. It doesn't have anything to do with anything except for what we're talking about right now.
Okay, well, you're not on the Kendall Mountain Steering Committee, so thank you for answering that.
It has nothing to do with the Kendall Mountain Recreation Plan. It has to do with our river corridor, which is part of our master planning process and part of the Kendall Mountain Plan too.
There you go.
Our river corridor is really important to us, and making a rash decision based on very little information. And you're thinking that we have had a lot of information on this. This was brought to us once in September, and then we talked about it one other time in a meeting.
And then the previous year when it happened. And then Mr. Revis used to include it in his reports on every single one of our town packets for
which we never discussed.
But you had the information, is my point. Whether or not you chose to read your packet and or devour all that information and try to make an informed decision for the future, that's up to the individual board members. I'm not saying anything like that, but I'm saying we've had these discussions. Okay, so what is it about the Kendall Master Plan that you think changing all this into a designated wetland area and vacating that so we don't ever have streets or roads put in there is going to change in the future?
I think vacating town property to private interest is a really serious matter that should be really thoroughly discussed.
And that is what our attorney and Mr. Ryder set forth to do after we gave them direction in September. So it was discussed. Now, whether we're at the last.
And the agreement that I see on the table in front of us, I still want to hear how this really values the public, because I don't agree that an easement that we have no proposed utilities to go through, a river corridor trail that we already currently own, and the liability equal the value of the taxpayers for the trade of 12 acres of property.
But it's technically unusable property. And there, if you look at.
You keep saying that, but I just demonstrated that there was not 12 acres of non-usable property in there.
That's not true. Lisa
Look at the map.
is looking at trading the rest of that section of land right there in all those areas that you were discussing into an additional conservation trust to keep it all wetland. I don't see, unless you're looking at the tiny little section that goes up and heads up this direction towards the parking area that Mr. Heinbach has right there, I don't quite see why that whole other section, I mean, maybe you want to say, okay, right directly here above Silverton Lakes, maybe we want to pull that little section out. Okay, but everything on the other side of the campground road and then the other section there, I don't see the problem with any of that because it's all wetland currently. Why are we going to try to keep it for future use when Kara was just explaining it's not that easy to get a permit to trade the wetland again? I just don't understand the argument here.
So Molly, Lisa has a beautiful idea, but that is in the future. And we can't base our decision today on something that she's planning on doing in the future. I mean, it's a great idea, but I mean, this is so much land, and we have a responsibility to the town to discuss it, and it's not enough, Molly.
It's not enough to put it into conservation trust.
Molly,
okay.
It is not enough.
Not enough to put it into a conservation
trust. No, can I finish my sentence? Just a minute, Molly. It's not enough for John Ryder and Paul to have this conversation. We need to hear what they recommend. Let me finish. We need to hear what they're recommending, and then we need to have the opportunity to discuss it with this group. That's a valuable thing to do, to have a conversation among all of us about their recommendations. We haven't had that chance until tonight. And we don't really have quite enough information.
Kyle, do you have anything else to add to this?
Well, I guess I'd be curious what sort of information in detail would be helpful specifically. You know, I can speak to the sort of scientific wetlands component of this. You know, I'm just curious what exactly you guys are looking for or what would be helpful.
Well, for me, number one, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
For me, number one, I think that it would be valuable for some of us at least to walk that land and walk over what we're talking about. Who's done that? Have you, Molly?
Yes.
Beautiful. Who else? Okay. Well,
I have. I've been down there. I've been down there walking my dog on the campground road. It's quiet right now, and I've been down there in the summer too. I think a lot of it is wetlands. I think this is a major decision though, and not one to be taken lightly. And I'm a little concerned that we're going to saddle a whole new group of trustees with making a very important decision without having all the information that they know. I'm okay if we need to do a little bit more research so that the board can make a sound decision on this. But generally not seeing too many issues here.
Put in another context for those of you who are on the board in 2017. Why was the 99-year lease commitment made if there were alternative plans for this particular piece of land? I was always curious why. I mean, it's got a 90-day out in it, the lease, but I mean, you know, 99 years would suggest there was a strong commitment to keep this a campground forever. And I don't, not having not been there and understanding the context of the lease, but it's just always been curious to me why the long term.
That would be
John, I'm curious
to know.
I'm curious why they issued a 99-year lease as well.
For $1 a year, I might add. I'm just asking because maybe there was some other context that long-term was committed to.
Wasn't that also given to the Bengals and Andriettas when they leased the property?
I think a similar lease has been in place since 1971.
I think it has too, and I think that's why.
Yeah, I remember, and I think Trustee Renowned's correct. I think what we did, we just rolled over the old lease, the old wording from the old lease at the time.
Yes.
There was use up there before though too. Up there at the northeast corner of what we're talking about, that was the kind of unofficial OHV parking area for a long time before the change in ownership. So in 2017, why we didn't try to negotiate some kind of parking up there or something, I don't know. I don't know if that was part of the agreement before or.
No, Austin, I can hardly hear because my speakers are going south, but I think the Bengals and the Andriettas, in trying to help the economy, set aside that portion for an OHV parking area. It wasn't part of their lease or anything. They just did it on their own.
I'd like to get back to Kyle's question. And he asked, what would be helpful for the board to see if, the decision of the board is to continue this. And so I've heard that a desire to walk the property is something that the board would be interested in doing. I've also heard that, there's a better, I guess I'm not going to probably use the right technical word here, but delineation of the wetlands within these streets and alleys would be another desire of the board. Is there anything else that the board would like to see to be better prepared?
Yeah, valuation of the property would be important so that we know how much we're kind of abandoning here to the right of way. I think there are some possible benefits that we can talk about. We can talk about the value that this will be added to the property taxes to the registers for the taxpayers to be able to utilize for the public good. I think that some more information too, as far as the quantifying the liability cost of the wetland disturbance and how much liability we stand on that. We stand to have on that as well.
I too would like to understand the tax ramifications.
So I think to better prepare the board, those types of actions, I don't know if our engineer would be able to necessarily look at the wetlands in the way, Kyle would be able to, and draw the maps identifying those areas. I think first of all, too, you might need a surveyor involved in order to specifically lay out where the streets and alleys are there. And so, to get a better idea of the extent of the wetlands, I think you're going to have a couple experts that you would need to hire here. And so I'm just making sure that the board is aware that those are probably not inexpensive by any means to be going to that extent of detail.
I would offer that if we do get into surveying, those costs add up very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe it's our obligation to our community to seek that information.
One other thing too that I haven't brought up yet too is that I did bring up in my letter is I'd like to kind of examine some of the other instances where this has happened, because I know that we vacated some streets and alleys in the past, and I know I've heard mention a couple times from town staff members, particularly past planners, that abandoning our right-of-ways down at the Y at the southern end of town was problematic for public works and for the town. And I'd like the opportunity to be able to kind of examine a couple of these instances where we've done this in the past, because I don't know the specifics on why. I've just heard that that's the way that it is.
So I have a question. Between September and now, why hasn't this been asked before?
It hasn't been brought up
wanna-
to us until a couple meetings ago.
But
And I
you
did
have
bring
the
up these
ability
issues.
to-
I did
to
bring up
meet
these issues.
in a letter that we just received a couple days ago. Okay, so I'm saying we have had time as a board. We're acting as though we haven't, this is like brand new, and this is the first time everybody's hearing about it. This is not true. We have had 2
It's the
years.
first time we talked about it, Molly.
It's not the first time we talked about it. Why wasn't this brought up in September? I mean, there's a lot of things that if you wanted these things, why didn't you bring it up during a trustee report and say, hey, how are we doing on the Silverton Lakes thing? Since September, we haven't heard anything. So there's a lot of things that we as a board in this, I'm referring to all of us, could have brought up and said if we really thought it was going to be this contentious from the last meeting as well. We all voted to make sure that this board that is currently sitting, because we're up on the issues, was the one to vote on this, but apparently we're not up on the issues. So I'm just really curious why all of this is coming out now when we had plenty of time to discuss
Molly.
this at different times.
This is not contentious. We're just trying to have a conversation. We're just trying to do our job. Molly, let me finish. Molly, hold it. Let me finish. We're just trying to do our job and we're trying to ask our questions. That's all. Everything is fine. This isn't a calamity.
Last meeting of this collective board. That is why we chose to have a special meeting.
We have we've asked some questions, Molly, and
Yes,
I've
that's
asked
right.
some questions. They haven't been
And they have
answered
been
until
answered by
tonight.
Lisa, Kyle, and Kara. They have been answered.
We're just trying, we don't have to make this contentious.
I'm not making it contentious. I'm asking very serious questions about why. Why are these questions coming up now? We have had plenty of opportunity.
Chris, could you help us here? And
Okay, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to everything that everybody has concerns about. I've also heard from people in the community that have had concerns about it. I have a concern that there are still questions that our board members are having trouble with. I'm the one that has to sign this thing in the end, and I'm not feeling comfortable doing it. I think that maybe what we need to consider is that we give it to the next board and we have them do what needs to be done. And Molly and Austin will still be on that board. Jess will be, I'm hoping, concerns are. And, you know, I appreciate what Paul and John are doing and everything, but I look at all the paperwork and my signature's happening. There's a lot of things that are now with everything else going on that people are concerned about. And vacating streets and, you know, it may not be a concern to some of us, but there's a concern because of everything else going on. And I mean, that's my point. I don't feel comfortable unless everybody on the board, you know, is going to say, yes, we want to do this, then I would consider it. But I'm not hearing from everybody on the board, except for Molly, that they're ready to do this, that they want more time to think about it. I don't know if that helps, but you know, that's my 2 cents. It's like we're trying to do something tonight and tomorrow we're going to have a whole new board.
I'm not opposed to this agreement. I just think we need more time to consider and come up and really think this through.
And that's what I'm saying, Austin.
Decision for the public. Yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you, Chris.
You know, I mean, if I felt like I was hearing from everybody that everybody was ready for it and they didn't have any more questions and there weren't any concerns, then I wouldn't be saying anything. I'd be doing having somebody do a motion, I'd be signing it. But that's not what I'm hearing from people unless I hear from other people. You know, I've heard from you, I've heard from Trustee Decay. You know, we've heard from Trustee Graham and I think Trustee Uyghur too, you know, and
Is it
so
time to make a
I'm
motion or
leaving.
do we have more discussion?
I know, you know, it's like, it's 9 o'clock and we've talked about stuff, you know, and gotten some new answers and some new ideas to think about. But we, you know, I don't think we're ready to actually do a motion. And
Can I ask a question? How much of the next meeting, the next regular meeting, is the old board involved in? Do we take care of old business?
I
Before
think typically you're gonna open the meeting and then approve the minutes of
Okay.
this meeting and last regular meeting. And would typically prepare a proclamation of some sort thanking you for your service. And then the new board would get sworn in.
Okay.
yeah,
Well, then basically what everybody's saying is put it off for the next board to deal with. And I'm in the middle. I don't like that. You know, I don't like the idea of throwing this in the lap of a new audit, more than likely. So they're going to have to start all over again.
well, and they may get fresh ideas, Barbara. I mean, we've been dealing with this for how many years now? I mean, I can tell you how long I've been dealing with it. But, you know, when I listen to all the new stuff, if you want to call it that, you know, then I get new ideas. So maybe having a fresh board that can actually bring in their information along with Trustee Varela and, you know, Mayor Pro Tem. I mean, they can bring in their information. So you've got fresh ears, you've got fresh ideas, and they may come up with something that we never thought about.
So can I ask, again, just to follow, I just want to make sure the direction of the board is clear to us. I've heard that there's a desire to walk the property. There's a desire to do some delineation of the wetlands, a desire to do valuation of the property as a whole. I assume pre-vacation and maybe after vacation too, to get the comparison of maybe the different values. Question on, you know, what is maybe estimates on potential liability. We want to see some other examples of past vacated roads. And I would suggest one other one too would be just to kind of go over the options of what happens if Silverton Lakes is not part of the final mitigation plan, meaning the town and Silverton Lakes are separated. I just want to make sure that the board has a full spectrum if that's what they want, you know. And just to add one more thing too, if there could be clarity, if the board wants to provide that direction, do you want us going out and hiring experts? And I guess that's a question for John too, whether it's in the budget or whether we can do that. But I see an expert for the delineation, potentially a surveyor, an appraiser. Those are people that would really need to fill in the details, I think, that the board wants.
I think that's a question for the next board.
Yeah, what are we doing? Putting questions down for the next board to have to deal with? I mean, these are questions that this board is concerned about, not the new board. I don't understand either. I'm kind of in a gray area here. They may look at it and think, what in the world were we thinking? You know, why did we put it off? We have the information. Why don't we do something with it? You know, why are we dragging it out?
Are you ready to make a decision tonight?
Probably along with everyone else.
I just wanted to make a motion to table it.
Okay.
So I'm going to make a motion that we table this.
Okay, so we have a motion to table this Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion from Mayor Pro Tem Lashley to table it. We have a second from Trustee Decay.
Do we know when it's going to be tabled and what the date is? I mean, when do they want it?
We're tabling it probably to the next board.
Okay.
So Austin, do you want to add that to your table?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Table this until the next meeting. I don't even think it's appropriate to give it to them on their first meeting, but we can certainly bring up the ideas and make them familiar with it in a memo and a note so that they can have a little bit of time to study up on it and what they want to see.
And this is Kara with the Corps of Engineers. I'm not really that familiar when the board's coming on. What is this time frame that you're referring to?
The new board, Kara, comes on tomorrow is elections. The new board, actually, there's a possibility of having 4 new trustees and a new mayor, for sure.
But the time frame, Kara, is April 13th would be the first meeting of the new board.
Okay, so perhaps some decision may be made by May, middle of May, then it sounds like?
Well, I get.
Yeah, it depends on if the new board is going to require this additional information to make a decision. I mean, surveying and engineering studies and valuations are going to take some time.
Right, and that's what, I mean, I guess that's what my concern is too. I'm happy that Ron started the phase 1 mitigation, even though he didn't need to do that, being that he doesn't have a permit yet. So normally people don't start their mitigation until they have a permit in hand. So that kind of helps with the mitigation ratios. But the longer we drag it out, the more increased our ratios become, which is the larger amount of mitigation that's required. So the larger amount of land that we're talking about, and if it comes to a standstill, then I'll have to start talking with my office of counsel to figure out what next steps we need to go, which could end up in a court case. So I just want to kind of those are like the worst case scenarios.
Thank you,
Kara. If a decision's not made in May, if we're going past the summertime to actually do something, be able to implement something, then I have a strong feeling that we'll probably start increasing the mitigation ratios, which falls on both Ron and the town's shoulders. So I just kind of want to throw all of that information out there when you're deciding on what next steps to take.
All I can see is a bunch of, meetings, special meetings to indoctrinate the new board, like she said, to make a decision in May. I think this is not fair to them.
Okay, Barbara.
I agree, Barbara.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Are we going for it? Kelly, are you still there?
Yes.
Do you want to do a roll call? And don't make it.
Trustee Barilla?
No.
Trustee Graham?
Yes.
Trustee Wager?
Yes.
Trustee Decay?
Yes.
Trustee Renowden?
No.
Mayor Pro Tem Lashley?
Yes.
And Mayor Tuckey?
Yes, so it's 6-2. And I'm sorry to everybody that's worked on this. I mean, I'm sorry, it's 5-2. And I'm sorry to everybody that's worked on it, but I mean, sometimes you have to go with the hard decisions in your gut, and I'm sorry.
Well, I apologize to Sharon and the family. This is kind of embarrassing to me, but that's the way it goes.
And Sharon and Ron, if you would like to say something,
Judy,
please feel free.
Let me get him back on the speaker here. There you go, Ron.
Okay, I'm not sure what we just voted on. Was it to table it to the next board?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, the board is own it, so there's not a lot I can do. And I do think that most of this land that was disturbed is in the 20th Street and the crossing of Cement Street. Just for everybody's information. I could be wrong, but that's the way I read the map. Maybe Kara could expand on that a little bit.
I don't have the map in front of me, so I'd let Kyle expand, but oh, do you want to put it on mute? Okay. Is it safe to talk?
Right now,
Okay. So yeah, it would have been the area that was essentially north and west of, between the highway and the road that runs along, what is that? What's the name of that road there? Is that Cement Creek Road? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, Kara, we can hear you fine. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing too. I'm seeing it's like this little triangle here, and I'm seeing the phase 1 mitigation stuff on 20th Street, more or less there. And you probably don't have that map in front of you.
I don't.
Maybe I can help. What's the question exactly?
A better description as to where the disturbed wetlands occurred.
Okay. Yeah, I can help with that.
Add it in one of your slides, Kyle.
Yeah. So, basically, do you see the barn that's by the gravel pad, and that's on the northeast side of, I believe that's 20th Street. And there's that red shaded area on my map. That is the wetland impact area. I'm just pulling up.
Kyle, is it the yellow area there or the red?
It's the red. So I don't know if you can pull up. I don't know if I can share my screen by any chance. Is that possible at all, Lisa? But I have
Yeah, we're not able to have you
Okay.
share your screen, but I do have, hopefully it's the correct map up there showing the blue and yellow outlines as well as the red shaded area.
Okay, great. And what I would say is that red shaded area is essentially on 20th Street, and then it goes up what is platted as Cement Street, and then it also encompasses part of Block 4. And I haven't calculated it in GIS, but it looks like maybe half of it's on Silverton Lakes land and half of it's on those roads and alleys that is owned by the town. So the wetland impact kind of occurred on both parcels there. The roads and alleys owned by the town and the Silverton Lakes campground property. And then just another kind of note from a kind of a technical standpoint about these wetlands. You know, the proper way to delineate those things is digging those test pits as I described, but you can do aerial imagery review as Kara was discussing, and you know, I haven't dug test pits in all those roads and alleys, so I can't say for sure, but I do suspect that there would be a lot of time and money spent doing that sort of delineation, only to find out, in my professional opinion, you're going to see wetlands in those roads and alleys, or you're going to see already developed campground land. I think there's going to be very minimal land, based on my professional judgment, that is not a wetland and not developed to date in those roads and alleys. Does that help, at least with the question about where the wetland impact occurred?
I think so, Kyle.
Yeah, it was at 20th Street, Cement Street, and the northwest part of Block 4.
Okay, I think with that, does anybody have any other questions or commentary?
Find out more information to satisfy some of the board members, and then we're going to have to cut other areas of the budget in order to pay for that.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Well, I guess the question too is, do we wait for the new board to get seated and express to them our plan? And in the meantime, we can try to get some estimates together, but really not commence any third-party work until the new board has taken seat.
I think that would be the best, Mr. Ryder.
This is Kara again. Can I ask one quick question? Can you refresh my memory why it wasn't possible to transfer that land in phase 2 to the town? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't really understand the transferring of the lease and the ownership. But if it was all into town, if that phase 2 was all under town ownership, and then protected in their, Paul, you can help me with the terminology, but protected in a covenant under the town, in the town, you know, without having a conservation easement, but in their own covenants as town open space that can't be developed and isn't protected underneath certain terms and conditions, it would still meet our need for, or, you know, that requirement for mitigation under preservation, if that's the route that's chosen for a mitigation plan.
So to answer your question, it's not. I mean, the town could take title to those lands and fee, but the issue is then it's a replatting versus meets and bounds. There's other issues with the ownership and liability. So I mean, it could be done that way. It's probably more expensive that way, and might have some downsides to it from the town's perspective.
Okay, I just didn't know how thoroughly that was reviewed, but if it was already reviewed, it was going to be more expensive, then it doesn't sound like it's an option.
It's an option for the next board to consider.
Well, if we're ready, I think we can have Mayor Tookie adjourn the meeting.
Okay. If there's nothing further, then it is 9.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
I wanted to ask maybe before we adjourn the meeting, if kind of while we had everybody here as far as the town board, if we wanted to consider having some kind of meeting for the finance committee or something where we could talk a little bit about how to hand over this kind of current COVID financial crisis to the next board.
Did you ask if we could have another meeting to discuss finances?
Yeah,
I
mean, we're talking about handing the next board a can of worms. I think the financial predicament that we're in is going to be really, really tough for the next board to grasp, especially in the early phases of kind of understanding town budgets and financing and all that. And I kind of was wondering if we should have some kind of meeting where we can really kind of discuss how to prepare the next candidates. I sent out another letter too regarding this. I feel like we should get together and figure out how to best pass the torch on this, because it's going to be a rough one for him, I think.
That would have to be this week, wouldn't it, Austin?
Yeah, or before the next meeting, as a work session before the next meeting.
I would support that idea.
You know, I hate not having something in front of us as a group to look at. This drives me nuts, because when, you say, look at map so-and-so, and you're trying to figure out where people are looking, and the same thing maybe with the budget. So we're going to have to be really clear with each other to be clear with the new board. Yes, I think we need to do that.
Yeah, it's not ideal for anyone.
Excuse me, Austin.
So what do we want to do? Hello.
Yeah,
I would agree.
Asking everyone else how they feel about it.
John, what would be a good date?
John, you're muted, sorry.
You're muted, John.
Well, my mother would like that if I was muted. Yes, Sharon Heinbaugh would like to say something. Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
There's a lot of screeching, Sharon, in my computer anyway, but yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so just to clarify, I think one of the problems that kind of muddied things tonight was that there was a lot of facts and figures and so forth, but not enough said about the benefits for the town. And the reason why Ron and I took this approach with the town council starting 2 years ago was because we wanted to save the town the expense of the mitigation, and I mean, we're talking 60,000, in this, and if we were willing to carry that burden, that financial burden, and keep the town from having to have that kind of financial burden. And that's why we listen to these experts, and they tried their very best to find the best route for the town to get this done as quickly as possible and with the least amount of damage done to the town. And even though it was the town who initially gave us the permits to go ahead with this build, because the powers that be that gave us those permits, they were unaware of the Army Corps stipulations. So, but that's all, in the past, and, we love the town and we were willing to sacrifice. So, there is no ill intention on our part. In fact, it's actually the opposite. We want to do what is best for the town, and we're willing to chop our heads financially for it. And as Tara, who the Army engineer expert said, the longer the time that goes by, and if you guys wait, they will take you to court, and you're talking umpteen thousands of dollars out of the town budget to resolve this. So again, just I just wanted to clarify that was the whole basis of this. There was no ill intentions. We were doing everything that was best for the town, and the town council and us, we've been working on this for 2 years. So All right. Well, thanks everybody for including us in this meeting.
And Sharon and Ron, thank you for everything that you do for the town.
You bet.
Okay, Mr. Ryder.
Well, we can make anything work for the board. So you guys, I guess, figure out a time and just let me know or talk about it now. We can meet, it would be best if you could give me a day or two after the election. So that would be Thursday or Friday. Town staff is working on a more official, budget cutting proposition this week in between everything else. So, Thursday or Friday would be best, just to give time for the election to happen and then more time for me to consolidate all of our staff cut proposals.
Do we want to do something before the meeting on the 13th?
That's what's proposed.
That's what I would prefer. And if we could, I think it would be great if we could invite the new trustees to the work session.
I agree.
How does that sound with everybody? So John, Mr. Ryder, do you think that if we convened at 6 o'clock, would that be okay with everybody?
What day?
Monday, the 13th.
No, we were talking about this the 8th, 9th, or 10th.
No, we were talking about doing it before the board meeting.
Well, John
Either way, I
mentioned
think-
Thursday of this week.
He
Yeah.
did, but
Well, if we want to, well, anytime after Tuesday, we'll know who the new board members are.
Uh-huh.
But 6 o'clock on Monday would work for staff for sure.
what about the board?
We have a regular meeting that night anyway. I don't see any difference. 1 hour isn't going to make a difference.
Okay.
I
so
mean, as far as our time goes, yeah.
I got a thumbs up from Jess. So there's a thumbs up from Molly.
yeah.
There's a thumbs up from me. There's one from Judy. Trustee Decay.
Yeah, she had a thumbs up too. Yeah.
Okay. And there's one
So
from
do you want
Austin.
to label this as a work session?
I
From
think
6
that's
until 7.
an easy way to do it, a finance committee work session or however we want to call it. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that good with you, John?
Yep.
Okay.
So we're good the rest of this week. We're going to meet next Monday.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. If
Welcoming
anybody,
in the new board with a tough talk.
yeah.
I mean, we might as well get them right in there.
They're going to get right in there. All right. Well, that's good. That'll give us plenty of time to prepare a thorough analysis of where we're at and where we're headed.
Okay. And then everybody can rise on Easter and we'll be ready Monday. Okay, so it is 9:33
We can rise on
on
Easter.
Easter, which is Sunday,
I know.
and then we'll all be ready on Monday.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
All
thank
right.
you, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Have a
you,
good
guys.
week.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Kyle. I really
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Kyle,
it.
Kara.
Thank you.
Very
And,
much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Appreciate it.
Sarah, this is
Sarah.
Jeff Figure. Thank you very much for your input.
Okay,
All right. Have a good night.
good night.
Good night.